I would like to come to our next term, which is Dissent, and our next speaker, which is Verena Hartbaum, my colleague at the IGMA. Verena Hartbaum is a research associate at the IGMA. She received her MA in Architecture and Urban Research from the program A42.org at the Nürnberg Academy of Fine Arts. She has been teaching at the University of Applied Sciences in Karlsruhe and at the TU Berlin, and published, amongst others, on the topics of retrospective architecture. Welcome, Verena Hartbaum.
Thank you, Stefan. Dissent is the communicated rejection of a previous communication, and thus the basic precondition for a conflict. Dissent arises from the fact that it is communicated in a spoken but also in a non-spoken way, openly and provocatively, or just as a cautious, gentle no. Dissent is the interruption of a process, of a communication, and creates uncertainty about its progress until it is assimilated into the process and does not disturb it any further. Following Niklas Luhmann, dissent fulfills a warning and alarm function since it indicates the inappropriateness of a state. In this, it is similar to an immune system. The immediate consequence of dissent is conflict. A conflict is, again following Niklas Luhmann, a parasitic social system that tends to absorb the resources of the supporting system for a certain time. An escalating conflict represents an existential danger, but at the same time, the conflict is necessary for survival, as it is the motor for modification and change. That's it. Pre-modern social theories describe conflict as an archaic state of nature in which humans are inherently violence-oriented. The church, as well as the state, created their legitimacy just by their opposite to the conflict as an element of pre-sociality. This has changed within the modern age. In the Communist Manifesto, for example, the conflict of interdependent classes take place daily as long as they are bound together by capitalist relations of production. Max Weber, as well as Georg Simmel, identified in agonistic actions the structuring process of socialization. But it was the FDP politician from the Liberal Party, Ralf Dahrendorf's book, Conflict and Freedom from 1972, that placed the social conflict at the center of social theory. All social life is conflict because it is change. In conflict, therefore, lies the creative nucleus of all society and the chance of freedom. That was Dahrendorf's thesis. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, new and numerous constellations of conflict became visible, and conflict theories, by now a discipline of their own, increased in virulence. Chantal Mouffe or Jacques Rossier emphasized the urgency of dispute and agonism as a basic precondition for democracy. With reference to Antonio Gramsci, these so-called radical theorists of democracy now consider the consensus as the end of politics, as a post-democratic instrument of rule, and as the end of all democratic process. Positive thoughts on the consensus, mostly with reference to Jürgen Habermas, oscillate between the ideal of reason and the model of deliberation or deliberative democracy. The unforced compulsion to the better argument is here, in the mainstream of democratic theory, the guiding idea of a communication among free and equal citizens. But this consensus remains idealistic. To use Niklas Luhmann's words again, a factual consensus on relevant decision contents is empirically not identifiable. Indeed, in highly complex societies, it is completely unthinkable. Luhmann suggests replacing the concept of consensus with the concept of legitimacy. Because legitimacy is not, as with consensus, about the voluntary agreement of decisions, because that would be extremely improbable, but it is about a social climate that institutionalizes the recognition of binding decisions as a self-evident fact. We will now continue to work with these two opponents and explore the question of what this has to do with architecture. Not without reminding that the space we are in has also emerged in a tug of war between dissent and legitimacy. In fact, the concept of legitimacy is extremely useful for architectural theory of modernity. What Adolf Loos still described in 1910 with the sentence, "The house has to be liked by everyone," as a difference from the work of art, which has to be liked by no one, has since developed into numerous legitimation strategies which are to be elevated as a basis of modernism par excellence because they served to cope with that enormous increase in complexity. These legitimation strategies manifest themselves in the form of laws, norms, and procedures. Today, planning and building would be impossible without the architectural competition procedure and, in general, a regulated system of awarding contracts, without the building use ordinance, without a fee schedule or the building code, and many more, as well as thousands of commentaries. This systematic regulation of construction begins in the mid-19th century in the context of increasingly stressful living conditions and in the context of the organizing profession. The greatest foundation of our present building and planning rules can be traced back to the centralization processes by the Nazis. In the context of the political and administrative reorganization following the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic in 1949, numerous procedures were initially placed back in the hand of the associations or regulated at the federal state level. In other countries of Europe and beyond, as well as in the east of Germany, sometimes surprisingly similar, sometimes completely different regulations were installed. All of these described documents and procedures have been updated several times until today. A climax in the development of the regulation was marked by the year 1977, when even those procedures that in the post-war order had still been placed in the hand of the associations or had been laid down at the federal state level were centralized once again. Also in the 1970s, social dissent was incorporated on a large scale for the first time. Disruption had first manifested itself in the form of protests or squatting, but also in the strategy of refusal expressed through manifestos and declarations. On a formal level, both postmodernism and deconstructivism were maybe also ways of questioning legitimacy. Finally, in the case of historical preservation and in the case of public participation, the potential for conflict had reached such a high level that further integrative procedures were needed to secure the continuity of planning and building. The urban development funding, the Städtebauförderung, laws on protection of historical monuments, Denkmalschutzgesetze, and the Administrative Procedure Act, das Verwaltungsverfahrengesetz. A shift in the organization of legitimation begins with a political and economic reorganization brought about by the fall of the Iron Curtain and the European integration. Adopted to EU conformity, some of the legitimation strategies just before confirmed with the reunification are increasingly in crisis. For example, legitimation through architectural competition is disappearing because it is less and less often conducted fairly and openly. The Baunutzungsverordnung, the Building Use Ordinance, is increasingly coming under criticism because it hinders the free play of forces in the market. The EU-wide award procedure has become an administrative headache, and the very special German fee schedule has recently lost its binding force. It seems that the days of those strict state regulations of the modern era are counted. Architectural conflicts such as Stuttgart 21 testify the loss of legitimacy. More and more, soft procedures of governance generate legitimacy of and for architecture. Although these are not new, they are becoming more and more important. What I mean is strategies of communication, for which there has been a separate state foundation in Germany since 2007. The mediation of architecture, the increasing importance of guiding principles and guiding lines, the Leitbilder. Just imagine the numbers of charters on architecture and urban planning has increased about 10 times since the 1990s. Moderated planning processes by external actors, or privatized procedures of quality management, such as the accreditation of architectural education and the certification system. I will not end with the question mark. This increasing diffuseness is initially not good news for dissent. Although the potential for social conflict seems to have risen sharply in the recent years, in the field of architecture and urban planning, it has become increasingly difficult to place a contradiction, to place a dissent, at least in terms of procedures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verena Hartbaum.